Hi, welcome to our July Liberal Values Lab. This July, this lab, we have Michael David Cobb Bowen. Michael, I remember the first time I said that name, you said that your name was longer than me, and so you let me tell you, give you a little bit of a background, Mike, why I was thinking about you. So, we try to do our labs and our panel discussions a little bit thematically. And so, of course, July, 4th of July for us here in America. And I was like, Mike once told me this great story about growing up as a Black nationalist. And I know that that has affected who you are. And there's not so many people probably don't know what that experience is like. So I just thought this was a wonderful opportunity for you to come and share your story. And for all of us watching, I know some people are watching who aren't a part of Circle. I would invite you to join Circle so you could be a part of the conversation itself. For those of you who are on Circle, I will be monitoring the chat. So when Mike is done with his presentation, if you have questions for Mike, please ask and I will help to moderate that. And with no further ado, with further ado, Mike, I wanted to share also what's fun for people who follow you. If they don't know, you with my co-author, Wingfield Twyman Jr., do a podcast on Free Black Thought, which is always fun and always a good conversation. So make sure to follow Mike there. And you can follow his Substack at MDC Bowen. And he also, that's how his most of his handles are Twitter, Instagram, and whatnot. So be sure to follow Mike. And now, Mike, with no further ado, welcome to our lab. Look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's always fun to hang out with you, and I'm glad to be here today. When Jennifer approached me with this, it was around the 4th of July, and I can't even remember what I was thinking at the time, but I am kind of in the middle of working with my father's estate. He's still around, and knowing that he was a significant guy down here in Los Angeles, LA County, where I live and where I grew up, I said, why don't I go back and really kind of hang on that thing that got me started, what made me want to be a writer, what shapes some of my attitudes today. And what I thought I'd do is give you an intimate picture, an intimate look about what it was like to be part of the Black nationalist movement. And there's a lot of things that have slipped through the cracks where we don't realize how complex and how varied the people were in the movement. And, my parents are still around and their memories aren't so good. And it's been interesting talking to them and bringing up old names they haven't heard in decades. So this is part of that process so I can share what it's like. Because when I wrote that I was patriotic, I still get, I don't know what it is, static about that. And interesting, one thing to know about me is that I was a Black conservative hanging out with folks from the Manhattan Institute in some of my early days as a blogger. And I won Black Blogger of the Year in 2007, covering Obama, candidate Obama. And but then I kind of, gave up on politics because I come from such a different background. I'm such an oddball. And so I think I'd like to give you an idea, which I hope can expand the way you think about what Black nationalism might have been, what it was, and how we think about it today. So growing up Black nationalist, it starts, of course, with my family. And if you think of Black nationalists, you generally don't think about a middle-class family. But here they are. These are my parents. My dad, he wasn't corporal yet, I don't think, but he went to UConn, and he was certainly part of the alumni that made UConn the basketball power, the house that it is now. And he was in the Marine Corps. He also studied sociology, like my mother. That's my grandfather on my mother's side, down on the left side, the tall guy over there. And he played jazz trumpet and was a carpenter, built his own house, traveled around the world with his New Orleans jazz band. And then my grandfather Raymond on my father's side was a house manager at a Yale fraternity, and he was an elk, a Shriner, and all those things. And I know, I'm sorry, I'm giving short shrift to these women, but my grandmother in the pillbox hat was a force to be reckoned with. We called her Lefty because she survived polio. My grandparents got married during the Depression. So they went through some hard times. And so they were always strivers. They were always trying to find their place in America, and they succeeded. And the next generation succeeded as well. So I come from a very large traditional family. And when my father was discharged, uh, he came up to Los Angeles, and we lived in the West Adams district, which was at the time pretty much the middle class Black community. We lived near First AME. We got an apartment there. Of course, I don't remember that, but we were right around the corner from First AME, the first, one of the more active churches, and the Golden State Mutual Life Company, which was at the time the largest Black insurance company in the world. So that's my aunt, my dad, and my mother, who always made her own clothes. Her mother was a master seamstress down in New Orleans, and she worked for the company that invented the seersucker suit. So if you have a seersucker suit, it's chances are that my grandmother was the master cutter who cut that fabric. But things turned around in 1965. I would have been 4 years old, so I honestly don't remember anything about this. But this was a moment of reckoning in Los Angeles, especially for my parents, who were both social workers. So they're very family oriented, as you could imagine. I was the oldest of 5 children, and their job was to help poor families. So this kind of changed everything. So I found myself under the tutelage of Ron Karenga. And Karenga, as many people know, and I've also often got flack for, was the inventor of Kwanzaa. And this was a photo taken by Look magazine that I found one day by accident in the Afro-Am Museum in Exposition Park in Los Angeles, over near USC. And I was one of the young Simbas. You can't see, those were yellow sweatshirts. So we were in our yellow sweatshirts on a long, hot summer day, marching in front of the Aquarian Center. And the Aquarian Center was owned by Dr. Lagan, who was the first and largest Black bookstore in California. And we were all close, friends with Dr. Lagan, more than anyone. So we were starting up. And by 1966, the year following the riots, my father founded the Institute for Black Studies. And this is 1966, as you can imagine. The Civil Rights Acts, the ink is barely dry on those. And then new radicals were coming forward. And we were always not militant radicals, but we were cultural radicals. And so, as you can imagine, some of the cultural Marxism appealed to my parents, and they were both kind of fallen out from their churches. And so we were ready to go. As things got more heated, and we had race riots every summer, there was a lot of thinking going on. And my mother said, why don't we go to northern Brazil? And we knew that the new city of Brasilia, the new capital of Brazil, was handing out free property. So that was supposed to be a socialist utopia. We didn't decide on that one, but I remember taking this passport photo and knowing that I was going to have to get shots. So you could see I wasn't so nervous because I was a fearless little brat. And then my dad, as I've been going through some of his correspondence, I found that he had picked Zambia. And to make the thing even more complete, on my mother's side, my uncle Bruce had worked for the Kennedy administration and was one of the first of the groups to be part of the Peace Corps. So I spoke Swahili and I spoke French at home, and I knew I had my uncle and my cousin in West Africa. And unfortunately, my uncle Bruce died in a car accident in Cote d'Ivoire. But we still had that international sense, and that's the side of activism that we were engaged with. So, with that, I always like to talk about that Black nationalism didn't stand on its own. There was the free speech movement, obviously, that a lot of people know about, and there was the conflict in Vietnam that brought a lot of people out of their houses. But we had many things that we had to do, one of which was the Watts Poets. So I have this old original copy of the first publication by the Watts Poets, published by Quincy Troop. Obviously, we probably used the printing press that Dr. Lagan had at the Aquarian Center to put this out the first time. And obviously, some of these people went on to make big names for themselves. My father was one of the older people in the group, and Ridiana became good friends with my mother. This was more my father's thing, but we did a lot of things. Um, the Institute was we moved to our first house in 1966, just after the birth of my second brother. And so the first thing we did was converted our garage into a stage. And so let me go there first, and we'll come back to this slide. We had workshops. So as a kind of prototypical community organizer, my dad and about a dozen other core members of the Institute ran these various workshops. So there was a children's workshop, and that was my mother's bailiwick because she was excellent with that, and it was part of her job as a social worker. Later on, she became a ward a place called McLaren Hall, which was the county place if you have to call the child welfare department or the parents are both gone or in jail, then you become a ward of the state or a ward of the county. And my mother was the woman who helped run that and as an officer in the court as well. So naturally, she was a great mom, and she was running the children's workshop. The writers' workshop had another name, I forget, but it was run by Margie Millsap. Margie and Nate Millsap were friends of the family. They lived over in Leimert Park. The Redwood Theater Group was run by my father. And like I said, we built a stage in our garage. And he really liked poetry. So you could see he was in correspondence with Leroy Jones, Clarence Major, and Larry Neal, and a lot of other people in the movement. Of course, he had a spate of publications. I have a lot of his correspondence. I would say I have, about at least 5 years of correspondence to people all over the place. And then he wrote something called Gemma. I have a binder that he wrote, I believe, in 71 on nationhood. Patterns was our regular newsletter. We put that out for about 5 years. The Circle magazine came out once. The 14th of June was an early publication. We were in correspondence with all kinds of folks. This one I could probably go on forever. And this is why I was kind of scrambling to see what was it like to be in that, because I saw my dad's writing in Negro Digest, in Liberator magazine. He would talk about things like the Orangeburg massacre, and he would talk about, who was coming up and who was going down. We were featured by the journalist Louis Lomax. We were on his show. He had a show, KTLA Channel 5 here in Los Angeles. So we were close to the arts, and I came close to becoming a child star. And I'm kind of glad that didn't happen because the child stars in my generation didn't generally fare very well. But I did go to the Watts Summer Festival. I remember waving to the crowd out of the convertible Cadillac. I was connected to the Ebony Showcase Theater. There was a kid named George Spell, who basically was my alter ego if I'd have gone into show business. And he did an episode of Gunsmoke, I believe it was, with Haas. That one's called Wishing Candles, and you can find it on YouTube still today. And my father absolutely nixed on that because the story, although it was going to be one of those big stories, one of the first interracial shows in which the Cartwright family, I think they were, kind of comes to the rescue of a poor black family who the Klan was trying to run off their property. And so the story opens up with me sitting on a porch lighting candles. And what you doing? Wishing? What are those? These are wishing candles. What are you wishing for? I wish my father was white. And why is that? Well, then we wouldn't get run off our property. And no matter how many times we went back to the studio, that was a line that the writer would not take out. And so you can't have my son. And that was the second chance. The other one, I was on the stage with Diane Carroll for Julia. Some of you may remember that show. So we were very serious and very close enough to Hollywood to have our cultural message and black arts changed. But as time went on, 5 years down the line from our original community organization, with my parents still keeping their day jobs in the Department of Social Services, we started communicating with local politicians. And some of the ideas for leaving the country kind of left. And so we were in contact with a great number of local politicians. And so I think there was a conversion at some point where we just said, well, you know, we're probably not going to leave the country. By this time, there were 5 of us. So, and my I want to say my baby daughter, but my baby sister was born in 1970. So with 5 kids, we were being practical, I think, by pulling back from some of the movement, which I think maybe lost some of its steam. But we were still heavily engaged in local politics. And so my father became appointed to become the special assistant to the director of the LA County Health Department. And that guy's name was Liston Witherill, and he was the boss. And my father and he got along just fine. And he was assigned to the committee or the commission, or I guess he was a special liaison, considering all of the connections that he had in the various black communities around the Southland, to get them interested in building the King Drew Medical Center. So that included the Drew School, which was a medical school certified, and then Martin Luther King Hospital. So as he began getting involved in that, things turned. And so one of the things that I like to say about Black Power is based on my experience, which is the various black folks, no matter how many you try to corral, all have their own different ideas about what freedom is and what they want to be in America. And I don't think you can ever align those agendas and corral them politically. What happens is kind of what we wanted to happen. If you look and think back to those strivers, was for us to be taken seriously in mainstream roles of America. So Black Power, when I think about it, is not an aggregation of black people demanding power. It is black individuals of exceptional skill who take over the reins of the power in America, in American institutions. Nevertheless, there's still things that we have control over, and that would be the arts, which it always had been. So my father became a photographer part-time, and he taught me how to take photos on SLRs. It wasn't so easy as it is today. But then that was always part of ourselves. We had a kind of, I want to call it a strong Black identity, but I understood that these were intellectual movements based on the things that were happening at the time. And certainly by the mid 70s, I think a lot of people were tired of the race riots. We were tired of the conflict. And I was never raised to hate anyone, and I didn't have a problem with white folks. And I didn't even understand that Jews were Jews. So it was in my 30s when I moved to New York, and people were saying, "Well, did you know that these are these kind of Jews, or these are these kind of Jews?" And I'm like, "I know there's the Fairfax district in LA, but we never had any gripes with them. My second grade teacher was Miss Paulette, and she loved me and I loved her. Well, what are you guys are talking about?" And it was just very interesting to live on the other side of the country and see, obviously, Black people don't think the same here, obviously, but that was Crown Heights in 1991, a different era. So the intellectual response to the way that Black intellectuals thought about the country in 1966 changed and matured. 5 years later, I think it was 1972, when Tom Bradley was elected mayor. And by the mid 70s, we had seen some real growth in the institutions that my father helped establish. So one of those was the Black Health Leadership Council. And so all of the county employees who were associated with the health department at the Drew School, at MLK Hospital, expanded. And so no longer was it small storefronts, and no longer was it part-time stuff out of community organizers' pockets, but we were building real institutions here. The Black Women's Forum was notable. I got to meet people like Maxine Waters, Teresa Hughes, Yvonne Burke, and Gloria Gray, who is still active in local politics here. Got on the California Public Utilities Commission. So we didn't get a nation, but we got responsibility. And we took our values and our flavor, and we changed the complexion of things. And when people got tired of fighting, we found that it wasn't so hard to do any of that. It was just people grudgingly getting pulled forward by people who were fearless and not confrontational. Just say, hey, look at it this way, and look what we've been through, and look what we've done. But I think one of the things that absolutely held us all together was family. It was, I'm tearing up because not all of us are here, but it was an understanding of, what are you going to do when there's riots in the streets? Are you going to go out there, or are you going to stay home and protect your family? And we had both of those. And understanding that my father was a U.S. Marine and he had a sharpshooter merit, he understood how deadly that could be. And that's why we never associated with the militant Black radicals. And so you always have to think about the various aspects of all of these individual human beings who decided to call themselves Black instead of Negro. And they thought we could form a nation. There were three options at the time. When I talked to my mother about this just the other day, and she said, well, we could do the integration, or we could take over Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, or we can go to Africa. And we communicated through all of those with the Institute, just the tons of letters that were written, and all of the exposure that we got. But ultimately, it was about our understanding of what a civilized place to live should be. And it's not like we came from extreme poverty and we bore this grudge. We were middle class. So I'm going to plug my book, which is edited by Robert Woodson in the Woodson Center. And this was my dad's slogan. And he always took us camping in the mountains here up Angeles Crest. Law, liberty, love, and land. That was what we wanted. We wanted order. We wanted freedom. We wanted our culture to be one of loving, and we needed space to do this. And so I grew up learning how to camp, learning how to hike, learning how to backpack. This was always part of our family. And we knew how to leave one environment and go into the wilderness and build civilization in the wilderness. And that was a very independent, self-sufficient kind of thing to do. That was Kuji Chagalea, self-determination. So we understood that absent man-made things, we were as free as we wanted to be. We could stay up there as long as we wanted to, as long as we could be self-sufficient. And then when we went back to the city, well, that was the 70s. The city wasn't very clean or very pretty. But we had that opportunity to know that kind of freedom. And I think it's something that younger generations are losing because they think all that they can do is fight in the city. Or if they get their slogan written on a street in the city, that's something. But that's not self-determination. And I guess my message is always one of civil liberty and self-determination. And that is as big a part of America as anything. So that's what part of Nationalist still resides with me. For me to understand, oh, who's this guy, Ralph Waldo Emerson? I read his stuff and I don't think there's anything I disagree with. And yes, we made friends in West Africa. And yes, we have family all over the country, but this is my country too. And I know how to not just survive in it, but to strive in it and enjoy my citizenship and enjoy my freedom and take care of my family. So that's it.
Thank you, Mike. And I will actually put a link to your book in the video that we put up of this on YouTube. So I'm going to open up the conversation now. So anyone who's got a question for Mike, go ahead and drop it in the chat. But while we're waiting for some people to come around with their questions, I've got a few for you that I'm curious about. So one of the things that you had mentioned, and I think this is one of the problems that some people have in their understanding of Black nationalism, or how it maybe it originally was, is this idea of cultural Marxism.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit more on that
Sure.
intersection of cultural Marxism and the Black nationalist movement?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, both of my parents had kind of gone lax in their churches. My mother grew up Catholic in New Orleans, as all light-skinned girls with straightish hair would in that district. She went to oh geez, I can't remember the name of the church, but anyway. And my father grew up Episcopalian in New Haven, Connecticut, and he went to St. Luke's. I definitely know that. But the idea that America was coming apart, they weren't going to just pray. They were going to do what they needed to do. And there was a different expectation of what the Negro could do. I always like to say in 1960, there were 20 million Negroes, and most of them were poor. And you could pretty easily second guess, oh, you're a Negro, you're probably poor. And by the year 2000, there were 36 million, mostly middle class. So how do we get from there to here? Well, we had to think all different kinds of ways. And the spirit in the country was there's going to be a revolution. There might be a Marxist revolution. Schools are changing. There's free love. Universities are changing their rules. The war in Vietnam kind of changes everything. And I think anytime you were a little bit insecure, you're waiting for some kind of reckoning. So we had a very difficult time to say, here's Kwanzaa. We're not going to do Christmas. And that was huge. And then we would go to the traditional churches, and some churches didn't want to have anything to do with us. And obviously the very few Black professionals that existed, they were Negroes. They weren't going to go with this Black stuff. And then, of course, there were the Black Muslims, and they were completely off in their own direction. So all those things were happening at once, and people hadn't made up their mind about it. This is a time when there weren't Black student unions on college campuses. And so people just didn't have any place to go to think about how to be independently Black. And yeah, so you have to give credit to the artistic, Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, was a big thing there. And everybody had a protest novel. So that was kind of the environment that we got started off in. And we were willing to say, okay, well, we can do this middle class thing, but how are we going to serve the people? And what is going to be the thing that's going to serve the people? And interestingly enough, neither of my parents ever worked for a private organization. They were always with the government. And I asked my dad, he says, well, how did you get more funds? He said, we just complained until we got more funds. And so they lived kind of inside that government bureaucracy where that was the thing that was providing for the people. And so I don't know how much more there's people that say we're somewhat socialist now, but that was the idea, for a clean slate. And maybe capitalism hasn't done so well for us so far, so let's try something else. And so there was a part of experimentation in that.
Well, you also say when you were at the very beginning that you were considered a Black conservative at one point. I don't know if you still identify with that or not, but what kind of took you in that direction given the way you were raised?
I was at the 2000 games in Sydney because my wife had worked with the Olympic Committee. And I watched the 4x100 relay team, all Black, drape themselves in the American flag. And I saw them booed. And I said, why is it these guys have just proven themselves to be the best in the world, and they show love and pride in their country, and they get booed? What? There's something viciously wrong with that. And I couldn't take it. I was like, why do people always assume that Black folks have this permanent gripe with America, and it's not proper for any of us to be proud of our citizenship? I said, look at my grandfather. He served in the Connecticut State Guard. They gave him a pistol and a badge in 1946, okay? Long before Brown. And my father obviously served in the Marine Corps. I didn't serve, my son did. And we had a lot of people who served in the military. And when you serve in the military, it's kind of, I trust this person next to me with my life. And a lot of people don't move outside of their neighborhood, their community, and know what it's like to trust somebody with their life that they've only known for 6 or 12 weeks. So this was a matter of patriotism. Mm-hmm. And I investigated the Black right, and I thought they would be all like me. I would be kind of a Ron Brown conservative. I'm a fiscal conservative. I had worked for Xerox at the time, and I actually programmed the affirmative action system. And there was something called a business roundtable, where we got the award for being the most progressive in terms of hiring. And I knew lots of Black managers at pretty much every level of Xerox, which was a Fortune 50 company at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I had lots of role models who were in business in corporate America leading. And I'm like, well, that's the kind of person I was. And I was just writing. I cheered when Reagan got shot when I was 20 years old. And I immediately regretted. I'm like, what's wrong with me? Why am I doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out that I liked Morning in America. And I wasn't afraid of Ronald Reagan. And I wasn't afraid of what all the white folks and the John Birchers they're going to do, because we were out there. If anybody was watched by the FBI, it would have been my father. So I didn't have to buy into always associating paranoia with blackness. And I didn't have to, I mean, I know Maxine Waters. I know Jesse Jackson. My father worked with all of those politicians on the Democratic side. And you kind of had to say, well, has it worked all these 30, 40 years? Let's see what the other side was. And so I was sitting with my dad and his best friend, who was a doctor at a well child clinic. And Dr. Luke told me said something that blew my mind. He said, you know, the Americans bombed the Japanese with the atomic bomb. And right now, we're best friends. So nobody respected the Japanese until we learned that they would fight to the last man.
Mm-hmm.
So don't be afraid to fight. And I said, wow. So me being a Republican, that's nothing. That's nothing compared to what the Japanese had to do so that they became the biggest sellers of automobiles in America. So it didn't seem to be a risk. It was just part of another journey.
Mm-hmm. Like, I've got a few questions from our audience. This one is from Joe Nelvin. Joe, hi. I'm glad you made it here. So he says, given the heterogeneity of the United States heritages, how do you view racelessness as a goal, individually and as a broader solution to racism?
I think cosmopolitan Americans shouldn't have a problem to do this. I think honest Christians shouldn't have a problem doing this. I've always wanted to go the class way. I always just said, let's deal with each other in terms of class, not race. And then I, went to Catholic school. I made friends with different sorts of cliques, and I made all kinds of friends with white folks, and it wasn't difficult. And so I said, well, finally, I got to the point, because I'm always going back and thinking about how is my identity changing? What am I learning that's new? What is Black now? Why would I ever tell Black people one thing and non-Black people another thing? If I'm really about liberty and justice for all, why does race get in the way? And I had to back up my associations. And I kind of got back to multiculturalism. And I said multiculturalism went wrong because people thought that races owned cultures. And it sounded like it was culture at first, but by the time we got through political correctness and Afrocentricity to cultural appropriation and whiteness studies, I just said, oh, this is not really culture at all. It's just going back to race. They're using culture as a substitute for race, and they're still going back to the same 16th century thinking about what race is. So racelessness is not easy to achieve because the background, you inherit a racial identity in America, and you have to decide what to do with it. And you can decide to take it seriously, and then you have race relations, and you can think about what white folks think about Black folks when they're thinking about white folks. And it's an endless circle. But ultimately, if you're trying to give a different weight to what that person says based on their perceived ethnicity or their racial identity or any of that, you're actually going against the spirit of equal opportunity, which is we, regardless of race, creed, color, religion, sexual preference, So you're either weighing and you're thinking, well, what should I say in front of this person? Or you're not weighing at all. And if you understand that and go through your thinking, ultimately, if you believe in the sanctity of the human individual soul, you will go raceless.
Another question from Elizabeth. You recently wrote on your Substack, July 14th, we all just dodged a bullet, that, quote, blood cannot call for blood. Democratic power must be responsibly handled. I wonder who is out there in the square like me who understands that. I wonder if I will feel isolated next week. I know I feel more isolated today than yesterday and more isolated than July 14th. How are you?
I'm doing okay. I got my boss is keeping me busy. I got to deal with family stuff, and I've rekindled my love affair with the New York Times crossword. And even though there's nothing on TV, there are some critics that tell me, here are the best movies that didn't win an Oscar. So I have other things to fill my life with other than the politics of the moment. Because, how many of these journalists are actually going to write a book? And how many of these media outlets are going to do a long-term study of exactly what? And so I've kind of limited my reading more to history, because current affairs, it's a zoo. You can't keep track of all that stuff, and everybody's trying, and I'm trying not to, and that's why I became a Stoic, which is I can't afford to let my inner peace become disturbed by this populism. And populism is, people just going for clicks, trying to get attention. And I don't have so much budget for that attention, short attention.
So, Mike, you mentioned Stoicism, and I love reading about your writing on Stoicism. And this kind of goes back to Joe's question with racelessness. You and you gave a talk one time on Stoicism being kind of the new DEI or alternative, right?
Yeah.
I would love to hear a little bit more on that and how that might play into how we get to a place of racelessness.
Well, the basic principle of Stoicism is that you shouldn't concern yourself with things that are out of your control. And when we talk about race, you recognize that no matter how high your profile is and you try to represent your race, you don't own it and you don't control it. There was a time in this country not too long ago that when the president got in trouble, he would go to Jesse Jackson and say, Reverend, pray for me. And he would try to make amends through that. And Jesse Jackson was an arbiter of all things having to do with race relations. And he became expert, as did Al Sharpton, in becoming mediagenic. But now we know that Jesse Jackson doesn't get to say anything about race. He doesn't get to represent. And it's not his choice. I'm sure he would like to be there. But Obama came around and bye, Jesse. And then somebody else comes around, Ibram X. Kendi, bye, Obama. And then we oddly and strangely, we get a lower class of victim that gets to represent what Black people mean. We went from the Jenna Six to Shaquanda Cotton to Amadou Diallo to Gamage to Michael Brown, where they burned down the town, all the way to Trayvon Martin. And when you get Nancy Pelosi kneeling in the rotunda and saying, I could be Trayvon Martin too, that's like, okay, that's what you think about Black people today. Now contradict that with that picture I just showed you of the strivers of 1959. Nobody thinks about, oh, your dad was a Marine Corps?
Right.
Yeah, you're so don't invest yourself in these racial ideas because they're not in your control. And whatever you do to signify that today is going to blow back on you.
I'm going to push back on that just a little bit
Sure.
and remind everyone we've got a few minutes left if you want to write a few more questions in the chat. But while we've got a minute, I want to push back on that. So I feel like I know your answer to this question, but we still are at a place where you are a co-founder of an organization called Free Black Thought. Together with the Institute for Liberal Values, Free Black Thought has created the Black Institute for Liberal Values. And a lot of times, I know we've had this conversation before, both with BILV, and I know you've had it internally with Free Black Thought. If we're truly to get to a place of this racelessness, are we doing a disservice by using that adjective Black to define these kind of movements that we're a part of?
Until people forget who George Floyd is, that'll be 5, 6, 7 years maybe. Until people didn't have to invoke the Detroit riots or the Watts riots. Because before I started this, before the George Floyd racial reckoning, I felt that I was kind of in a neutral place. I was like, nobody's trying to invest extra in their race. We can figure out how to get along, and race is not, it's in an equilibrium. But then we got the George Floyd moment, and everybody said, oh, I've got to rethink everything I thought about race up till now. Clearly, the civil rights movement didn't do it right. So now we have to say Black bodies. We have to talk about Black bodies. We have to talk about African descendants of slavery. And so mine, I hope, is a considered response to some reactionary stuff that I'd rather not have to deal with. But since I'm philosophical, I want to help people think their way through it. And I can do that without slogans, without political speech. Just say, here's how you free your soul.
And I see it too as kind of a counter movement, if you will, to the BLM, and even though the Black is in our names, Free Black Thought, Black Institute of Liberal Values, it's an attempt to show the diversity of Black thought. I think both of us, both Free Black Thought and BILV, our ultimate goal is to be free thought and just the Institute of Liberal Values. But we have to meet people in the moment that we're in now. And, we're not in a moment of racelessness. Hopefully some of the work that we do get us there. But let me, ask again, we will always be in a place where America's history is America's history. We'll never get away from that.
Yes. Right.
And it was, very ugly history. So this is where I'm not sure that we ever get away from racelessness, because someone will, in 200 years from the future.
No, I think we can.
You can.
And
okay.
Here's the reason why. Number one, Coleman Hughes is one of those people I'm glad is out there writing, so I don't have to write that stuff anymore. But also, Free Black Thought is largely academic. And it means there has been a failure in the academy, in the humanities, to teach people properly. Because here we're minting PhDs in these grievance studies, and that is going to perpetuate itself. So we are building new kinds of race conscious people more than we had before. And so there's absolutely a need for an academic movement so that we can influence teachers, because there's a basic dynamic, which is I'm probably the only Black person in the room. So I have kind of this advantage to say, okay, well, this is what my Black experience is. And if mine is a boohoo story, then everybody wants to be sympathetic. Why not? But when the ethnic studies departments go wrong and become ideological and become political instead of part of humanities, that's a problem for everybody, because it messes up the basis of our understanding of our American citizenship. When we start weighing people intersectionally instead of as individuals. And we have to understand that everybody is not a minority. We're not minorities, we're people. And so as long as they're teaching that, somebody has to come up with a better curricula. And I think I'm proud to be a part of people that I know are doing that.
Amen. Yeah. So we've got another question from Joe. This may be a bit off topic, but I acknowledge I am obsessed with the representation through generative AI. Oh, you're gonna like this, Mike, because you are also a techie. There's a lot of human bias built into these language and image models. Have you given any thought to how our cultural tropes are getting part of these models? How to supersede those tropes, even though our language inadvertently becomes their leading edge? And he says maybe we need a Michael Bowen avatar chatbot.
I actually did one of those because there's forums that I engage in where it's snappy answers to stupid questions. But I do want to know what the average ordinary Joe on the street wants to know. One of the answers is a movie called Samsara, which I'd seen before, and I watched it again. And you sit 90 minutes watching these extraordinary images and music, and it's like a Godfrey Reggio, if you're familiar with Koyaanisqatsi or the Qatsi trilogy, where all he does is takes his camera and goes slow motion and looks at all of these different cultures around the world. And you kind of forget, you feel like you're an alien being given a tour of the beauty and the ugly of planet Earth. And so I'm thinking about dance as nonverbal communication. There's going to be a very long time before we have a Baryshnikov bot, right? So what are we doing to center ourselves on this textual stuff? What are we doing to center ourselves on manga style cartoons that we know that can be computer generated? What are we doing to center ourselves on CGI productions? And look what Star Wars has become. So we have to think about where we have our value as human beings. And civilization requires trust. If we get to the point where we trust machines more than we trust each other, then we'll be in trouble. We've gone through dark ages before, and maybe you have to retreat to the monastery where you're safe behind walls. I hope not. But in that hopefulness, there is an understanding that you can see me, that you can hear me. If I decide to talk like Desmond Tutu, you can hear me, and I can make an impression on you by the expression in my face. And that's real. And we can do that in multiple languages. We can do it in dance. We can do it in song. We can do it in poetry. And maybe these arts will become more important when computers have mastered text. Because there's sometimes I just need a bunch of text. All right, I'll pawn that off to an LLM. That's fine. But there's other things they can't do, and they'll never do.
Well, and it's too bad too, to Joe's question, the biases that are being written into some of these AI programs, that it is playing with these tropes that pulls us back from this idea of viewpoint diversity, this idea of individuality, because it groups, us based on with certain characteristics based on our skin tone. And I'm not quite sure how, outside of having these conversations and speaking up in the way, that we do here or elsewhere, that we are going to change, at least not immediately, the programming minds that are coming out with this.
I don't think we are. I mean, you do have to think about this in the same way you think about other oligopolies. There's only a few people or a few companies and entities that are going to have the wherewithal to build these massive new data centers that have all these chips. I'm going to short NVIDIA, by the way, that need these massive new chips, that need this massive amount of power to do this thing that makes us just a little bit more lazy. But we can go to the question of Kujichagulia, maybe learn something from 1966 and say, what about your self-determination? I mean, what do you do? When's the last time you put on a backpack and climbed a mountain? When's the last time you packed a sandwich lunch and put it in a bag and ran? These things that are totally under your control. That's what you want to do. Get out into the wilderness. Maybe stay silent for an hour and see how you can communicate with somebody silently. Uh, there's all kinds of things that we can do to, get stop the doom scrolling, because we already know that it's bad.
Yeah.
And if so many Americans stop littering and stop smoking, we can do this too.
Yeah. Yeah. I think as an adult, I can hear that and appreciate that. It's really the children that don't have the mindset yet that we talk about. You mentioned ethnic studies, right? These
Mhm.
things are being taught to children who haven't had the mindset yet to really be able to process this
Mhm.
information critically
Mhm.
in a way that so if this is something that our children are absorbing right now, I worry about how this is going to affect us going into the future. And going back to this idea, can we get to racelessness if
Mhm.
our kids are seeped in it through both AI and the way we're teaching? It doesn't even have to be AI. I
Right.
love and this is where I love, I'm, kind of going off a bit on a tangent, but this is where I love your idea of stoicism. And I think, something that could be implemented in place
Mhm.
of some of the stuff that we are teaching in schools as
Yeah.
an, yeah.
Part of this is my abstention from politics,
Mm,
because I just stopped believing that one of the parties are going to deliver a solution. They're not going to deliver us from evil. They can't.
mm-hmm,
And so if you can stay out of that conversation just enough to realize, well, maybe this thing that Gavin Newsom said is not going to build a high-speed rail. So maybe I'm just not even going to vote for that. And all they're going to do is, ask for another park, or they're going to hide behind a ballot resolution so we don't really know which side somebody's on, because it's the committee to do nice things for America, right? That's so when you abstain from politics enough so that your hopes and dreams don't depend on that, then you can take a long-term view and say, well, did that really pan out? Did that really get better policy? And I think in order to get better policy, we're going to have to think more long term, which means pulling ourselves back from the fast paced, fast media, fast information, and think a little bit more long term. I'm a member of the Long Now Foundation, which is in San Francisco, Stuart Brand, and they're making the 10,000 year clock, among other things. And it has helped me think about more long term ideas. And Danny Hillis was one of the guys. He invented the supercomputer. I mean, he made the fastest supercomputer in the world back when he was doing that. And he says, well, what's this going to be worth in 100 years? So there are wonderful, beautiful traditions that we already have that are hundreds of years old, like
mm-hmm.
gardening, like the recipe for pepperoni pizza, that they're always going to be good. And so if we go back to some traditional thinking, or just infuse a little bit more of our present with the long past, we can know that we're doing something that has been good for humans for a long time. Nobody can predict the future, or as Yogi Berra said,
I'm
prediction is
gonna
very hard.
It's called the Long Now Foundation. Is that
Yes, long
right?
now.
Okay. I'll put a link to that also. And as a reminder to everyone here, this will be out on YouTube in the next 24 to 48 hours or so. And also to stay tuned, because on Thursday, we are having a conversation, Mike, on America's political transition. So you're talking about like long term, and we're dealing with, there's so much, like you said, immediate right now. But we'll
Mhm.
be doing that on Thursday with Peter Zion. And remember to follow Mike at MDC Bowen on Substack, on his social media. Mike, it has been always a pleasure. Thank you for your collaboration, your friendship, your sharing of your story. Appreciate you.
We'll have shrimp.
All right, everyone. Have a good evening. Thanks for joining.